live. Oh my god.
You're live.
Wait, it's our thing.
I'm going to turn myself off here. Okay. Actually, I'm going to turn. Mute my mic too. It's just you right now. Awesome. So I can see your stuff. Okay. And we should, if I go over to here, you should see it there. Oops. Yes.
Yes, what?
You're there's a, I guess, so you're somebody coming to our YouTube channel sees your discussion here. Awesome. There's this one I need to figure out how to blow away. That little dinking around thing that we've had.
Yeah. Kind of so much irony in this presentation that I'm giving a privacy presentation on Google Hangout. It's not escape me. My friend was like, "Is it being recorded?" I'm like, "If I say yes, will you stop being friends with me?" I guess I should turn off my mic.
So your computer just like melts into a pool of irony. People understand.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember
Are we not doing the on-air thing again?
We are.
Oh, we are.
Yeah, we are, actually. Yeah, just trying to do it officially, even though I'm not sure if anybody's online. So thank you, everybody, for being here tonight, or coming out on this Chinese New Year's Eve. And so this is our continuing series this term of trying to have more provocative, more discussion-oriented TWeds, where we still have opportunities later in the term. If anybody, Enrique has agreed to do one later on this term. That's awesome. Matt, who's just coming in right now, has got our next TWed in a couple weeks. Laura is doing a TWed in a few weeks as well. But we still have a few slots available if you want to volunteer, and we're looking for it. And don't hide in your laptops. But some of the topics that people are, we did a survey over the break and at the very beginning of the term of the kinds of topics that people wanted to hear about, and we've heard about some of those already this term. And Kristine is going to be talking about one that's incredibly topical right now. You can't go a day without some bit of news about a data breach or a privacy breach or a privacy policy stupidity. There's always something going on. If you took the time to look at some of the references that we put in the announcement, there's just some amazing things going on. So Kristine has a part talk, part discussion, part exercise for us. And feel free to hop up and grab some pizza. We should have plenty tonight. And take it away. And we and while you're getting started, I'll just make sure
people can see my screen. Okay, so for those who just walked in, I've been asking folks to grab a sheet of paper and some sort of writing utensil. So if you don't have one, please grab them. And yeah, go grab food. Like, this is totally informal. Don't make you feel like you have to sit and listen to me babble for 45 minutes before you get food.
So how is night?
Oh yeah, it should be live. There should be a YouTube.
Yeah, if you go to the YouTube that was in the announcement. Yeah, and one other thing I just wanted to note, as usual, this is going out live. It's also being recorded. We're using this term where we've been using Google Hangouts on air, so so people that are away are able to directly link into our TWed YouTube channel, and I sort of act as a live editor here. I can choose what they see. And
control the horizontal and the vertical?
Absolutely. I control the semantic.
A lot of power to give you, John.
It's way too much. Way too much.
Okay, so while I'm waiting for everyone to come back and grab pizza, I was toying with the title of this talk, and everything is always like, privacy is blah, future of privacy, blah. And so I wanted to kind of keep it very open-ended because that's kind of the goal of the talk. So what I plan on doing is, and I'll lay it out again, is to give sort of that 30,000-foot viewpoint of a lot of fairly prominent topics about privacy, and then kind of open it up for everyone in the group to discuss some of the topics and then help guide some discussion. Like John said, I'm going to try to make it as interactive as possible, so if you have questions, if there are things that you want me to go deeper on, please just shout them out loud. Again, we're trying to keep this so that I'm not lecturing for 45 minutes. I have some slides to get some key topics out, but I really would prefer that you guys just kind of interrupt me. And then for anybody, if anybody's out in the ether, I guess there is a comment box, so hopefully John will be monitoring that while I talk in case there are other questions from out there. I'm just going to leave that there. Okay, so I'm going to jump in because it looks like everyone's pretty much ready to go. And while you have pizza in your mouth, I'm going to make you do this. Okay, so here's part one of the interactive part. What comes to mind when you hear the word privacy? On that piece of paper that you guys have, write down up to, you know, as many words as you'd like when you think of the word privacy. When someone says privacy, 3 to 5 at least. 3 to 5 at least. And just automatically, what are some of those things that come to your head when someone says privacy? And I have a little disclaimer at the bottom for people like Dominic. This is not going to be kept. It's going to be completely anonymous. I'm going to get rid of the data afterwards. So, and I'm not going to be using it for any future research. There, that's my social science disclaimer for all of you in the room. And then once you're finished, please pass your papers to Omar. And he'll be putting them in a nice visualization for me while we do the rest of this talk. Thank you.
Yes, the big block letters at the top of the page.
All right. Okay. So when I've given this talk before, I usually start off with this slide because it's kind of has been my life for the last 3 years. If you had walked into my apartment in the last 2 years, you would have seen, right when you walk in the living room, this gigantic piece of butcher paper with a bunch of things related to privacy.
This is the Elbonian version of the semantic web.
Yeah. So as you can see, it's a topic filled with a lot of different concepts, right? And I think I put it in the invitation that it's this enigma, right? Like it's wrapped in all these different associations and technical literature, but I have been trying to sort out these connections, and I felt like this was the best way to do it. And then like a year ago, I scrapped the whole thing because it was just overwhelming to see this as you walk into your door every day, and then realizing that you don't know where the paths start or lead or stop or whatever. So, but this is a pretty good summarization of the last 2 years for me. So, like I mentioned, I wanted to give you guys hopefully a 30,000-foot view of what's going on in terms of key topics in research, and really get us from this current understanding to what I say is a future understanding of what privacy means for us now. We can get to that in a second. This is a fantastic quote from Erwin Altman in 1977. I want to be very clear that privacy is a social concept. So it is. He did a bunch of readings and writings for the Journal of Social Issues, and he came with this really concise way of framing it, saying privacy is culturally universal process, meaning that in a general way, throughout history, through every culture, there is this idea of privacy. Whether you share something, whether you're not, it's a very, in a general sense, that is a shared cultural universal process. Where it's a specific phenomenon is in the particular behaviors and techniques we use to regulate privacy, right? And so how you regulate it might be different from how I regulate it, and it might be based on some sort of psychological thing. It could be based on what my mom is sharing, et cetera, et cetera. So So I thought this was a really great way of framing kind of the complexity of what we're looking at. So again, this is kind of a sparse. It's not obviously exhaustive, but these are the literature, these are the domains, these are the different fields that have written with and have cross ideas in terms of privacy, right? So there are a lot up here, and it makes the literature review a little hard, but there are some key points that I'm going to try to get through today. So I'm going to up-level it to these three main things, right? So technology, the human side, and the government side. That's kind of fairly large buckets, and I'm not saying that they're all-inclusive. There are some blurred lines here. So technology and government, obviously, technology and the human. But just to get some of the key concepts again, I wanted to kind of bucket it. So another interactive part here is choose which hole you want to go down. Anybody raring to really want to hear about one specific to begin with? You want to hear about the human first? Okay. All right. So the human. Let's see if I can do this correctly.
Wow, this is really.
Yeah, right. I'm like pulling up my old PowerPoint skills here. Okay, so this I thought is a great comic from XKCD of the different opinions about what online privacy might. Maybe you see yourself in the reflection up here. I would say that I'm probably between the conspiracist and the philosopher, maybe a combination of all of them. But again, this kind of goes back to the Altman statement where the individual behavior and the psychological underpinnings vary person to person, right? And there are social norms and social habits that happen that help frame that, but what I'm trying to point out here is that there are actually quite a few psychological reasons as to maybe why you share or don't share information. So human is also kind of inclusive, not just psychology, because obviously it's not just psychology. I'm also throwing in here ideas of anthropology, social psychology, cognitive science, cognitive psychology, etc. This slide's a little text heavy, but it's important because it highlights some of the most recent empirical findings about how we share and what we don't share. I think the most poignant one is the first one I have up here, is that actually in cognitive psychology and behavioral economics, disclosure behaviors are irrational, which we'll go back to how that's really important when we talk about the government side. And that is due largely to biases that we have in our mind. So we have this, we judge what we share and what we don't share, this really complex calculus based on our environment and based on what we know. So we have relative judgments and we're bounded by certain attentions, right? And it actually says that this idea of giving people additional control can actually lead to increased and riskier disclosures. So this is kind of an important finding. It's still relatively new, so people are going back to it and testing it over and over again. But it's kind of important to understand when we get to the technology rabbit hole and we get into the government rabbit hole, this notion of control and how some of these tests are actually countering the idea of control, and also transparency and mandatory disclosure and informed consent, which are all legal aspects we'll get into later. So I have a whole bunch of these types of studies if anyone's interested in learning more of those. Okay. So again, this is a very high level. If anyone has any specific questions, I'm more than happy to go into it. Any other?
Sure.
Yeah.
If you could go back.
Ooh,
Can you actually go
yeah.
back?
Yeah, I can go back.
Okay. So the first 2 points
Yeah.
sort of together. The first one is just saying that when they take disclosure actions, they can be irrational.
Yeah, they can be irrational, right?
Not just the concept itself, but they can be irrational based on these biases.
Sure.
That sort of thing.
Yeah.
And the second one is when you actually put them into the driver's seat, it does lead to riskier.
Right. And there are a couple of studies that also point out that people who hold really strong privacy beliefs actually behave counter to what they say they might. Run counter to those values. So you can give them motivation. You can raise the motivation for, if you click this, but you'll have to give away this information. You'll get this for free, or you'll get this prize. And people will do it despite the fact they've said I have really strong values about privacy. So there are some really interesting user studies here that are kind of filtering into HCI, which we'll get into under technology.
Members of Congress that act that way too.
Yeah. Okay, so another one. We've gone through human. Anybody? Government. Oof. Okay. All right, government. So this is, again, overview. The United States does not, the word privacy does not appear in the U.S. Constitution or the Bill of Rights, which gets people sometimes because everyone's like, oh, it's the right to privacy, but it's not explicitly said in either of those documents. There's no single law to protect privacy in the United States. It's all sectoral law, case law, and public policy. And the way that we frame it here in the United States is the person who has the rightful access to the data owns the data, right? So there's this notion of an informed consent that has to come through, because even though it might be the data about you, you technically don't own it. It's the person who has access who owns it here in the United States. Yep.
But don't you also have access to that data?
Yeah. Well, yeah. Yes.
How
But
does that work with multiple existing parties?
so perfect example is Fitbit. Technically, the data that you're producing is your data, right? But because the agreement that they've written on the terms of service, they contractually own your data for the reuse and sharing of that data. If you ask them for your data, that I can't remember if they specifically will give it to you. I think they will. One of them doesn't actually.
Fitbit might.
Yeah, I can't remember which
certain
one
medical
does.
device
Won't.
makers won't.
Right, because you're using their platform, and that's the agreement that you come to when you sign on to use that particular service.
But
How
there
does-
are states.
Yes, I'll get into that. Yeah.
But how did that? A lot of those GLOs and stuff like that don't stand up to court anyway. Just because you
Yeah.
put something in there doesn't make it law and stuff like that. Doesn't this counteract that? That if I still have access to it somehow, so say I can open up my Fitbit and take the data out, I do
Right.
have access. Don't I legally still then own it?
Yeah, but
No matter
Yes.
what ELA says about whether that I do or don't.
Yes, except that it hasn't actually. There hasn't been
been
case
tested in
law
court?
yet that has been
right.
tested.
Yeah, and in
Yeah.
fact, there's a number of layers. There's the case law and the validity of
Yeah.
EULAs, and then there's also like untested. If they've got something that looks like DRM,
Yeah.
preventing you from getting access to that Fitbit data, and you get access to it, they could bring you up in the MCA.
Yeah.
That's true.
Yeah.
So you actually have, it's the irony that you have access to that. You may have rights to that data, but you by DMCA you can't bring the protection to the data.
Yeah. So again, that's the key here is that all of our most of our approaches to the law requires this idea of an informed consent. Also, a very rationalistic approach to policymaking, saying that if you give people enough information, they will make an informed consent because they're rational enough to make that kind of a decision, right? Because you give them all the information. So this is where things like mandated disclosures are important. So anytime you go to the doctor and they have to give you a form that says your data can be shared here or your data will not be shared here, those are mandated disclosures. And that's because we so heavily rely on informed consent, right? So because we told you all this information, you're making this decision to share or not share your data. All right, so I put in here the European Union, which is kind of the opposite end of it. We have in Europe, it is actually a fundamental right that is codified in their human rights document. They have one omnibus bill, the Data Protection Directive, which applies across all member states and across all sectors and across all data types. And for them, the data subject is the user, the owner, the person who actually produces it. And so they have the legal right to control the data regardless of who had access to the data. And they actually have agencies where you can go in and report, hey, I want my data, like I want someone to stop sending me these marketing things. Tell me how they got my data. Like that's a complaint you can bring up in the EU. And again, the difference here is that they have explicit consent. You have to make sure that you give explicit consent to somebody else to use your data. Recently, This was mentioned actually at the Cybersecurity Summit last week at Stanford. This notion of habeas data, which was actually came up first in Europe and which is the foundation of a lot of the data protection directive, but it's very, very strong in Latin America. It was, I think it was first used in Brazil in 1988, and it's designed to protect an individual's ability to complain to a constitutional court, the need to ask for their data back or to protect their data, etc. So this is a mechanism that we don't have in the U.S., this idea of a habeas data where I own my data. It actually translates to we command, you have the data, right? And we don't have this concept here in America. All right, so I'm going to go deeper into American dates for privacy. These are sort of, I wish the blue was a little bit stronger. The blue ones, okay, so in America we have privacy for your environment. We make very strong notions of what you have in terms of you and your environment. Privacy of the body, so Roe versus Wade, anything related to female rights, reproductive rights, and then we have informational privacy. So the ones in blue are the key, sort of the key dates of information privacy in the last 40 years or so. So I highlighted all the way back to the Bill of Rights because as you progress through here, what you'll see is that the First and Fourth Amendment, which is the freedom of speech and obviously the right to a peaceful assembly, and then the Fourth Amendment, which is the right to prevent unreasonable search and seizure by the government, are the key foundations for almost all of the rest of this timeline. I want to point out that the Privacy Act of 1974 is incredibly important because this is where the Code of Fair Information Practices, which governs the maintenance, use, and dissemination of personally identifiable information, was created. So FIPS, I'm sure some of you guys have heard of FIPS, is used across the board, and it has been used to shape even the European directive. So there are certain, like, it has to be accountable, it has to be transparent. There's, I think, maybe 11 different characteristics that has to fit when you're using a personally identifiable piece of information. Okay, so I call this alphabet soup or layers of protection. Actually, what we have, when you think of how privacy and data works, you have it on every level in the United States. There are, I think, approximately 31 states that actually have the right to privacy codified in their constitution. So you have protection on the state level, you should have protection on the federal level, and then you have protection on an international level. I always say, shouldn't this mean that we're doing this? Like, shouldn't that mean that our data's, that we've preserved privacy in a sense? But actually, this is what they say is too narrow prescriptions of policy, because you just look on the federal level, all of those pertain to a specific sector or a specific usage. And it can start to get kind of messy. And then the tension between the federal and the state level is also a really interesting one that people have been starting to understand. Because, for example, the one that I highlighted here that became effective in January 2015 is California's Senate Bill 568, which is the privacy rights for California minors in the digital world, which allows them to claim a right to be forgotten. So when you're under the age of, I think it's 18, you can petition for the internet, or for that service to take down your information in the state of California. So this is now kind of playing out in Europe with their right to be forgotten, but it's going to be interesting to see how California will adopt it and implement it. Okay, so that leads us back to, I guess, the last one, which is technology, which I'm really surprised you guys didn't want to go first. Not gonna lie. Okay, so privacy, the solutions you guys probably know actually better than me, but I got these kind of buckets from this paper, this wonderful dissertation paper by Seda Gersis, who spent years with privacy engineers. and she started to understand their process and exactly how they created certain solutions. So the first ones are privacy-enhancing technologies, which I'm sure you guys have all heard of. The objective is to minimize the collection of data and to provide the control over the data post-collection, right? So I put a couple of examples up here. I just recently found this Privacy Lookout project, which was presented at TWed last year during a workshop on privacy and the semantic web. Looks promising. Seems a little complicated, but might be an interesting way to give users back the control of where their data goes and what people are doing with their data. And the typical types of solutions here are things that are related to anonymity. So anybody who went to the anonymity talk today, that's a type of PET. Identity management systems, and then the privacy policy languages that there are quite a few of. So then there are privacy solutions. Again, I'm sorry this is text heavy, but these are the ones that are focused on the actual data records, right? So we've got tabular data analysis, differential privacy, and then social network data analysis, which is sort of different because the graph data cannot be anonymized using the same methods as you would for tabular data. And there's a lot of work going on here. Differential privacy is TWed's work from Microsoft, and it seems really promising, although the last talk I went to with her where she presented to people were like, I don't understand how this, it was very math heavy, and it seemed really like it was unclear how you would execute on the theory that she's giving. But she does have a lot of proof points, which I highly recommend anybody who's interested in doing the data record and the collection section portion of privacy to kind of look through. And then this one is relatively emerging, at least I think it's emerging. It's called the Web Transparency and Accountability. And these are people who are going to the web as it is and trying to expose essentially people that are violating privacy, right? And so OpenWPM is a platform out of Princeton, and that's the Open Web Privacy Management. It's a platform that allows others to detect, characterize, and quantify privacy impacting behaviors. Dark patterns, which is really interesting, I saw it the other day, exposes user interfaces that have been carefully crafted to trick users into doing things that they probably shouldn't be doing. And he's got a whole list of examples on there that are really, really fascinating. He's a cognitive psychologist by training, so he was using that literature to help inform what he would say are insidious approaches to design. I think he has several about Facebook, where they have you go through several layers of clicks before you get to the actual decision of what to share. Then he has some for Apple, same thing with like turning on the tracking or turning off the advertising tracking on your phone. It's not actually very clear like where you're supposed to go and things like that. So he's got all these like different parameters about how you measure how deep you have to go to a website or on a service in order to contractually opt in or opt out or something.
So how does he differentiate between intent, malicious intent, and really crappy design?
I'm not sure if he has anything. I mean, you would imagine that you would go and interview the designers to see, but I doubt they would admit if they did it maliciously, right? And then kind of to sum these up, again, from Zeta's dissertation, is that the privacy research, there are 3 privacy research paradigms in computer science. One is that of confidentiality, so the idea of hiding, which is anonymity and hiding the information about a person. The second one is privacy as control. And again, these also overlap. These are not rigid by any means, but hiding or confidentiality obviously helps with the information self-determination research paradigm, and then the last one is privacy of practice, which is the identity construction. So this is where you intervene with existing data, the flows of existing data, and you have to have some sort of feedback mechanism. So privacy mirrors is a big one that she talks about in her work, where for example, on your Facebook page, you can do a bunch of different settings and then see what that would look like before you agree to the settings. That is what she considers a privacy mirror, right? So there's some sort of feedback the user gets to understand what that environment will look like. Okay, so
private Googling on privacy mirror doesn't
give you very much.
I did that this morning. I mentioned that it doesn't give you much. It just gives you the wrong thing.
Okay, so to kind of sum this up, I wanted to bring back what are some of the perceptions people have of privacy, and this was a recent survey released by the Pew Research Center that surveyed over 607 adults. Oh yeah, no, we're getting there. We're getting there.
Mark committing to
No. This is an actual survey. This was just a play survey. This one had this had the exact same question that I posed to you guys. Tell me what comes to mind when you think of privacy. And as you can see, personal is really big on here. The top one is 14% of the surveyed adults said security, safety, and protection were their most associated concepts with privacy. In that same survey, which I find really fascinating, 91% of adults say that they agree or strongly disagree that they've lost control of how their personal information is collected and used by companies. So again, this is really, really poignant because we've pushed so hard in government and in pets this idea of control, yet the general American public thinks they have no control of their data. So there's a really big disconnect happening here, right? And I think that's something that's really important to kind of come to terms with, and also kind of what I would like to hear from you guys, like, well, what's going on? How do we address that, right? Also on not on the slide, but within the survey, 88% of adults agree and strongly disagree that it would be strongly agree and agree that it would be very difficult to remove inaccurate information about them online. So there is some really strong notion, like, once it's out there, that's it. I can't do anything about it, right? And then 61% disagree or strongly disagree with the statement, I appreciate that online services are more efficient due to the increased access to my personal data. So 61% disagree with that statement. They actually are kind of like, I don't care that it's not as efficient because they have, or it's as efficient because they have my data. And then, but contradicting, and to go back to the human psychology, 55% would agree that they are still willing to share that information with companies in order to gain a free service. Right? So you could have all these, like, I know that it's bad to share it online, and that someone's probably taking it, and that I don't really care that it's more efficient, but if you give me something free, I'm totally going to give you whatever you want, right? So there's some really interesting work on, like, what are some of the price values that you can assign to for people. Okay, so to sum it all up, like I mentioned, public policies and regulations are either too broad, European style, or too narrow, American style. Technologies are most effective when the problem space is well defined. So that's why you have 3 research paradigms in computer science that cover a very complex abstract idea, right? And then that massive amounts of data create such personal and social benefits that the collection will be unlikely to stop in the next X amount of years. And then to throw another wrench into it is that people's understanding of privacy needs is fuzzy, and our actions contradict our stated preferences on privacy. So we have these really almost push and pulling happening within these 3 segments. And so if you're thinking of how, one, not to have the end of privacy, then what can you do, right? And so that's where I'm going to leave it at. I open it up to what's next, and would love to hear what you guys have to say. I did have a quote in here, Warren Brandeis, who essentially what are the the cornerstones of the right to privacy. When they wrote it, it was because of yellow journalism and this idea that cameras shouldn't invade our space. And in their paper, they wrote that it's been found necessary from time to time to define anew the exact nature and extent of such protection. And it's very much that same happening now. And so that's why I kind of offer it up to see what you guys think we can do about either redefining it, thinking about what those terms of protection need to be for us moving forward. So I'll leave it there, and I'm going to have Amar send me what he's created so that I can put it up here. But if anyone has any questions, I'm going to try to go do two things at once. Or did I just confuse everybody even more?
Well, yeah, I think so. This can be overwhelming.
Yeah.
So I think the way to do it is to sort of do people have questions? Yeah, that's a good place to start. Do people have questions about privacy or anything? Yeah.
So, for these policies to be enforced in a court of law,
yep,
wouldn't you have to draw some distinction as to what is data?
Yeah. Right.
So I'm just curious, what does the U.S. government or any other interested parties see as data?
Right.
Because
so
that's not an issue that's even resolved theoretically in science circles or anything.
So in America, we have what we call the personally identifiable information, right? So that's what they consider the data that needs to be protected. So for HIPAA, that's, I think, 12 different types of things: your social security, your birthday, like things that they think will be identifiable if of a person, right? So your location, things like that. In Europe, they have what they call personal data, and then on top of that, a layer called sensitive data, right? So what the problem with the way we're approaching it now is PII is, again, if you remember the different layers of slides, is different for every one of those policies. So it's not a consistent definition of what data is. And with more of these, more works coming out saying it doesn't even matter if you isolate it as PII, because with big data you can locate somebody in 4 degrees without having any of these, right? So I think law works by definitions. Like, that's how we build on top of things. Like, this is defined in Article A, blah blah blah. This is, if it's not in this definition, then it's really hard for us to enforce it. And the problem is that's kind of a cultural thing. So until law kind of catches up on how that works, like I don't think we'll have a really good sense of, unless it's like just data period, but no one's going to be okay with saying any type of digital information's data that fits under a protective data, right?
So to put a kind of a magnifier on what you're saying. Yeah. So HIPAA, do people know what HIPAA is? I think it says, so it's the health, I don't know what, I can't.
Health information portability.
Right. So
privacy.
It's what protects your information, personal identifiable information in the healthcare area, the healthcare data area. And so it only applies to that. So it's got its own definition of that personal identifiable information, and it only applies there.
Yeah.
There might be other. I don't actually think there are.
Well, for FERPA, which is the Federal Education.
Oh yeah, the kids.
For anything that has to do with your higher education, there are certain parameters of what that data is considered private or sensitive.
It's what keeps your mom from being able to go and look at your grades in college.
And same with the financial sector. Yeah. So, and that came about because when we took away Glass-Steagall and you were allowed to create conglomerate banks, they wanted to make sure that the data shared was not identifiable, or that it was highly protected data.
But, so I just wanted to point out, so there's not like a standard standard law which is governing the protection of that same personal identifiable information
Across,
across all those
no.
domains. No, it's only in those pretty narrow.
Yeah.
Now within those spaces, it can be very rigorous.
Right.
If, for example, in HIPAA, there or healthcare provider organizations go to a great extent. You know, a couple weeks ago there was this big break-in data breach at Anthem. Their healthcare information was perfectly protected. That was not an issue at all. It was more on sort of the interacting with the consumer management of the accounts and that sort of. It was still like 80 million records.
Yeah.
But but that was not the healthcare data. It was this other stuff. So.
Right.
But yeah. So defining what it is the big thing.
Yeah, and like you said, theoretically, there's not a strong definition of it either, right? So if we had even just some basis, I mean, I guess there's some basis, but not one that would hold across sectors and hold across different use cases.
So here's a question.
Mm-hmm.
Going to technology, since we're familiar with semantic web technology
Sure.
and that sort of thing, and various kinds of declarative languages and ontologies, can you talk a little bit about what work you came across or have come across that is trying to help solve the problem?
Sure. So there's a couple. I guess the one most prominent one, and probably the one that's built out the most, is our accountability systems, which was Professor Hendler worked on it, and Danny Weitzner out of MIT have worked on it for several years. But it builds on an ontology that is I'm going to butcher what it is. It's AIR ontology, and it's more of here's our policies for how data and privacy should be protected. If it falls out of these, then we can make sure we can hold it. The system can hold that violation accountable, right? And so that's one big one. HTTPA, which is one on the protocol level that we saw last year when Oshani came in from MIT. She's also worked on that, and that's built off of the personal PPO ontology, which is, I'm going to butcher again, personal privacy ontology, that's being built out of Ireland. And that one's actually really interesting because it's not specific to a type of data. It gives the attributes and relations of a data. So you would actually say, like, is part of this document, as opposed to saying Social Security, like giving it a strict identifier. But we sat through going through the ontology, and it's hard to get your head around.
It actually looks more like is it actually, I thought privacy protection.
No, I think it's.
I think you're right.
Okay.
But it's actually more like, so PPO is a lot like you would think. Let's imagine you have some arbitrary graph, and there's data in that graph that you want to sort of carve space around and associate handling rules with. That's pretty much what PPO is.
Privacy preference ontology.
Yeah. So you basically can decorate that graph at a pretty sophisticated level with this this information model, this overlay information model to protect. I look at it more as it's an access control kind of thing. It's like a semantic access control thing, with the motivated use case being protecting a person's information, but it could just as well be used for lots of other protecting scientific data, that sort of thing.
Actually, I think a lot of the technologies are access control systems, right? Like, who can access this data based on this definition of data, and who can control that information. So I haven't seen anything that moves from a different direction, and maybe it is just a matter of access and control.
Was traceable.
Hers was traceable, yeah, but it's still access and
right.
control.
But on that, but one of the things we were looking for when we were looking at is, could you, so you could control, you could describe rules about who could access part of a graph. Could you say what happens? Could you have rules for logging access? Could you have rules for outcome? These sorts of things. And I don't think we found any rules for that. And that would be, so policies, a complete policy is who can do what with what, and then what. It's not just do I give them access or deny access, but what do I also do? Do I monitor? Do I log? Do I log in a specific way? That's kind of the root of
yeah. It's really interesting because there's actually not very much incentive in America to be pro-privacy or privacy protecting in your systems, because even if you violate one of the laws, you might get a fine, but even the fines aren't what most people say would be proportionate enough to make it a motivation to be protecting of the privacy. I think, Europe has I think Europe is like up X percentage of your total revenue for the year is the penalty that you will be given if you go against the directive. In the U.S., it's an arbitrary number that the FTC comes down with. So there's not even that kind of motivation for people to put privacy first in a lot of their designs.
There's another thing you didn't really talk about is like that whole domain of VPNs and Tor.
Oh yeah.
And that
like the anonymous.
I'm wondering if in talking about privacy, writing down your thoughts on privacy, if that occurred to anybody, that came to mind. Anybody who's from China or worked out of China saying, maybe.
Yeah.
But that also.
Yeah, no, that's a huge set of literature.
Access.
Gabrielle Coleman writes almost exclusively on anonymous and hackers, and she has some really fantastic insights into what motivates people to join these kinds of networks, and then the techniques they use to continuously be anonymous, which, as we kind of heard today, is actually kind of difficult even on Tor, because there has been ways to expose identity on Tor. And so, yeah.
I was going to say, I was reading an article just this morning that a friend of mine posted about, I don't know if you guys are familiar with the Gamergate thing going on, and how they threaten a lot of female employees in the gaming industry and game journalism industry. But there was an article that was like an interview with a kid who had done swatting in the past, which is where like you get enough of someone's personal information that you can call the police to their house, essentially. And like the kid that they were interviewing, he was like 16 years old, and he was like, I'm done with that life. So he was like already done with this at 16, and just discussing some of the methods they use and all the social engineering was just like, it's kind of scary. I feel like there's probably a lot of education that needs to go on with that too. Yeah,
I mean, I think a big problem in terms of the general public is that people fight really hard to protect their data, but then when it's taken, they pretty much give up and say, well, that's all I can do, or they don't try to fight to get back their privacy, which there's actually some work on this idea that that this system that we've built has caused us to be exhibit learned helplessness, because we're just like, I can't do anything about it, so that's the end of that, right? And so I think that's really important, because the problem that I've in the community of the pets when I go to some of their workshop is like they've got some great tools. They've got some really great tools to make sure that you can, browse anonymously, etc. But people don't download them. They don't use them. And even today during our talk, she mentioned that, the talk that we were at, a couple of us were at earlier, she found that it was hard to get people to want to anonymize their writing style or to even adopt some of the recommendations her system was offering for people to hide the way they write, because it might be a usability thing, right? Maybe they're not doing the right kind of usability test to ask what would resonate with people. So part of it is that there are tools, but the education is a huge one. Most people are just like, oh, you know what it is? Nobody in my immediate circle has ever had their identity stolen, therefore it's never going to happen to me. And so when there's not that residual salient violation, there's no likelihood for someone to change their behavior.
Does anybody here have their privacy law going?
Okay.
Everyone talks on privacy in terms of the event that triggers the privacy breach.
Uh-huh.
As an example, an analogy. It's not illegal to sell metal capsules, gunpowder.
Right.
But if you use them to make a gun, it's legal.
Oh, right. So all this in
You
like
have so in terms of data now, if you have a data set, and you have a second data set, they have like personal data randomized or masked, anything. But when they got together linked, lost, you may find something.
Right.
And that may trigger a privacy breach.
Yeah, there's some work in the in differential privacy that tries to figure out what might be some of those triggers. I'm not well versed in that, but there's certainly some work in the data preserving or the privacy preserving avenue that are trying to figure that out. I don't know that. I'm sure I'll have to look into it because that would be an interesting way to figure it out.
The open data community deals with that.
Oh, they do. Okay.
The mosaic theory.
Oh yeah, the mosaic.
The same thing of releasing state secrets, the combination of open data sets. While the data sets themselves don't have any confidential information, the combination thereof could release state secrets that they didn't want to. Yeah. A lot of that same literature applies in terms of confidentiality of state secrets. I mean, you bring up an interesting point earlier. You talked about once people lose their, have the loss of privacy, stuff like that. Do you have any other resource for them? Why would you not give up? There's nothing. There literally is nothing you do. The data never becomes more secure. It only ever becomes less. It's like entropy. You're fighting against it. It's impossible. In a long enough time scale, all data is free open. Right. Eventually. You never go the opposite way. You never get more privacy. You only ever lose it.
Right.
So once you lose it, you do give up. At what point is there anything else to do once there's new photos of you out there linked to your Facebook profile? I mean, people have had this happen to them. You're kind of done. You could try playing the mole game, the whack-a-mole game, but that's exactly what you're doing. There's nothing else to that breach. And just like people not wanting to use these tools and play around with them, we see this everywhere and everything. We don't back up our data, even though we should all the time. Everyone talks about backup hard drives. Who does? Who here today in our lab has your data backed up?
Yeah.
And just TWC, we're the most technically capable people, in this country. We're all studying this stuff. But how many of you have a secondary backup source of your own data files and your data? Few of us do. Most of us don't. When's the last time you backed up anything in your hard drive?
Yeah.
The last day or so.
Yeah.
We know it's supposed to be the case.
Do it all the time, man.
Yeah. Some of us do.
I don't have a hell of a lot to back up. I'm like that guy. It's like, go ahead, take it.
It's the same thing,
Well,
in our house, we shouldn't be brushing our teeth more often. We shouldn't be eating carbs or whatever it is this week and stuff like that. Yeah. It's just another thing on the list of things we should be doing, but don't.
Well, I think I think that there's probably a huge Venn diagram of the different intersecting views, and I think people have a combination of that. I think that there's nihilism, but I also think that there's, I think a huge amount of people don't have a mental abstraction of what's going on, so they really don't understand how things fit together. They might understand at different levels, but they don't have a good. Most of us have a pretty thorough understanding of how systems work and understand or have a certain have a model at least of how the data is being handled by a particular place.
Yeah, but they still know it's an issue. You just the survey, that Kristine referenced, over 80 or 90% of people know that it's an issue and it's a bad thing, and they're probably not doing it right. At the same time, they don't do much to care about it.
Right.
It's not an educational issue. I think there's been enough more stories in the news that we all know it's bad.
But you still, I mean, here's an analogy that's going the other way. I don't know how many people have asked me about those stupid phone calls from the Windows support. We've detected that there's a XYZ problem with your system, and if you give us this little piece of information, we'll help you. It's these crazy phone calls. There's no way in the world these people have any knowledge of your system at all, but they're calling you up. It's hilarious when it happens to a Linux guy and he's talking about my Windows machine.
Yeah.
But the point I'm trying to make is that there's a lot of people who don't have a good mental model of how things work. There's also a lot of people below a certain age have a kind of a disconnect. They think that the online world is a whole separate world. It's not.
Won't affect them.
Yeah, it's not going to affect them. Oh, that's just online. And that's so they. I think that goes a couple different ways. It's online. It's not going to affect reality.
Right.
It's the here and now. It's not going to be a persistent effect.
Yeah.
Which is kind of a different view of. That's like an exhibitionism that happens because they don't think there's any implications.
Right. One of two things that I've always kind of used to describe or explain like the importance of understanding how your data, the importance of kind of protecting your data is I always use the example of when I was growing up of obviously like putting your information on Facebook and being, I used to look at people's profiles before I brought them in for interviews, right? So that's...
Patrick says...
Oh, yeah.
Patrick's comment was, once it's out there, isn't it too late? So
right.
He's agreeing with that earlier comment, but he also said, if you want your data backed up, just tell me.
Yeah. just let Patrick know.
Sure to do that, Patrick.
Yeah.
That's his gentle way of saying, if you need your B server backed up, let me know.
Thank you for the friendly reminder, Patrick. And then the second one that really resonates with people is we can use that information in your divorce. And then people are like, what? Like, you can bring that into court to use in a divorce case? Yeah, whatever you write on Facebook can actually be used. And that usually gets people to think, oh, well, maybe I need to figure out, like, what I'm sharing, what I'm not sharing
Facebook
a little bit better.
Not Las Vegas.
Yeah.
But Las Vegas and Facebook.
Yeah. But I always get so many questions about, like, when I use those types of examples, that's when people are like, oh, okay. Because for some reason, the stealing your identity one doesn't seem to really resonate with a lot of people. I don't know why. I mean, I would be mortified if someone took my social security number and then it's almost impossible to get everything else. Like, my name is already long enough that, like, if someone took my social security number, I just moved to a different country. So, I have a different weight on that. So, here are your keywords, or your words that you've put to, that you've submitted to Amar. Amar, this is by frequency, right?
So, by frequency.
Yeah.
This is interesting.
Right, yeah, I know. I was just reading it. I thought it was really interesting. I tried not to prime you guys with any ideas or words beforehand, so it's really interesting to see what comes out. Comes up bigger. Oh, next to it? Yeah, sure. One second. Let me get it.
I think some of these go together.
Yeah.
Sure it's not big card awareness, brother?
Well, that's the difference.
I mean, this is the one from.
Can you do it over here?
Maybe.
Oh, you can do that. Good. I'll bring that on forward.
Okay, we'll figure it out. Okay, so that you can kind of see some overlap and some. Granted, this is a 607 person survey, and that one is what, 10? But it's kind of interesting to see what comes up there. Anyone have any particular insight? Discrete, that's an interesting one to come up there. Very.
I think this is actually a better summary than that one. Well, so there's some similarities.
Yeah.
Personal is quite large. In fact, I think I'm correct. It's large in both.
Yeah.
Password, which is a how.
Yeah.
Really is very prominent here. Information is large.
Security almost. But security.
Yeah. So data, which is a much more specific thing. Fear. I don't see fear. I don't see fear coming. Does anybody see it here?
No, it's not on there.
Fear. Maybe it's implied by all those people, but fear. But things like leak, family.
Yeah,
this
that one's
is
interesting.
Very interesting. You guys are good. Family being so prominent here. It's also very, very current. But this is
Privacy and private can be.
NSA made both.
Hello?
Celebrity is interesting.
Yeah, it's very current.
Sony.
I don't know whether Doom is referring to the game or the general outlook. So here's a question. There's sort of there's views. And I can't remember who the first person was. It Eric Schmidt or there was Eric Schmidt. There was Mark Zuckerberg. And we've seen more recent ones. I can't remember the Yahoo, the Washington Post Sunday. We're basically saying the future, privacy is dead. There will be no privacy in the future. And they have various arguments for that. All of them are incentivized to say that, to talk about that, because in two of those cases, in Eric Schmidt's case, Eric Schmidt is the CEO of Google.
Right.
Mark Zuckerberg is Mark Zuckerberg. Their businesses are knowing everything about you and leveraging in every way possible. There's this article that we're referring to from Washington Post, where it's basically saying a more general view that the world in the future, in order to work, will depend upon no privacy, our data just moving around. It's like the fuel, and therefore said it's you can get over it. And do we actually think that's the case, or do we think that maybe a big chunk of the world may work that way, but there will be private islands? I'm wondering what people think about that.
I don't know. The biggest organization on earth can keep things private, the U.S. government. So what chance does some other you literally have the $1 trillion, the U.S. government, even in the 70s. You have Nixon, the most powerful man on earth, can't keep tapes in his own, in the most powerful office on earth private. In the 1970s, before any of this stuff even existed, that can't be private. I mean, we have, someone who can leak, even for you have Snowden and everyone else, leaking information on Earth. The most powerful organizations on Earth who have all the money and literally, financial and military power can't keep seeing their own things secret, and other governments as well, and actively going against that. Then what chances normal people have of doing anything like that?
Right. So you're saying our systems are inherently human.
Yeah. And you can't fight it. We have people trying to fight it, and it's a no-win battle. Then it's eventually good. It doesn't ever get more secure. It only lasts. And it's almost inevitable to a certain point. And I think the bigger issue that we didn't talk about at all, I find kind of surprising, is about the power differential that takes place. Privacy at its most fundamental level is about power, about having power for someone else. You know something that they don't know about you, ergo you have power over them in terms of how you use that information, what you did on them. That's the whole reason why we want to keep it secret. That's what it comes down to. We didn't discuss that whatsoever at all, that power differential. Mm-hmm. If everyone knows everything about everyone else, and if everyone's naked and no one has clothes, then are you really naked anymore? You know, I mean, does it really matter? You know what I mean? The power differential has now been leveled completely. You know, so is that really the case anymore? The person whose clothes on is king. You know.
Well, so this is an important thing to say, and this is the same line of reasoning has been used to. This is why we must have spies. This is why espionage is seen as international espionage is seen as justified, because if we did not have that, we couldn't maintain that balance. You know, if the Soviets didn't know what was going on in the United States, and if the United States didn't know what was going on in the Soviet Union, that creates an imbalance of uncertainty. But if we have inside information about what's going on, then that can, it's argued, has a moderating effect. Is that an analogy to what you're saying, that if we just level the playing field,
it's all about power differential and stuff like that. Yeah. So as long is Mark Zuckerberg knows more things about me than I know about him. He has more power than either blackmail or other issues and things like that. That having privacy and protecting that is having power over someone else. It's just like informed consent. Is it really informed consent and stuff like that? If someone has complete or different power over my decision, is it really interactive? You know, do I really have any choice in terms of these different decisions around me? You know, we have different legal things that are based on the precision of our own agency. But you know, time and time again, the different social sciences, that's not the case. There's giant separation in the power differential between the haves and have-nots, whether you're talking economic or political. And so if our legal systems are based around that, in terms of the consent, then it really even exists in the first place. And the differentiating levels of power completely skew all the things, and yet is hardly ever addressed or talked about when we talk about these things, you know.
I think, they are addressed in they are addressed in really interesting ways, because from an economics standpoint, it's asymmetrical information theory, right? Like, this is precisely what that is. And then from surveillance studies, it's the idea of...
I just want to make sure we get a couple things in.
Oh,
okay. So Patrick had a couple different questions, and I'm going to... So going back to your... Can you go back to the diagram that the word cloud?
Yeah.
So Patrick was wondering if people put down family because they were concerned about members of our family, perhaps older members of our family,
right,
who may not be as aware and tech savvy as we are. If that was the concern. Does anybody want to comment on that? Or are we just concerned about protecting our family? Have more of a general concern. Does anybody have a theory? Does anybody want to disguise the reasoning behind a possible theory? Okay.
Can you hear me?
The other, he was asking if you could say a little bit more about dark patterns.
Yeah, that's why I brought it up.
Okay.
Okay, so actually this is a good segue to the power talk, because this is precisely what dark patterns does, is try to expose, in this sense, through a design standpoint, who owns most of the information. Sorry, I'm trying to find my screen here. Where is it? There it is. Okay. Right. So, so user interface is designed to trick people. He looks at a bunch of different patterns. For example, the bait and switch, the disguised ad, price comparison prevention. Is there a particular one you guys want to look at? Trick questions.
Privacy Zuckery. See that.
Privacy Zuckery. Okay. The act of creating deliberately confusing jargon in user interfaces which trick your users into sharing more info about themselves than they really want to, as defined by the EFF, so the Electronic Foundation. The term Zuckering was suggested in an ENF article by Tim Jones as Facebook's evil interfaces. It is, of course, named after Mark Zuckerberg. So I'm assuming that is this. So this is what that privacy for this. Yeah, choose your privacy setting, customize. So in this sense, it's claiming to provide a new simplistic privacy choices. However, in reality, full privacy is an effortless process requiring a user to visit multiple pages. So this requires several different settings on different pages in order to get a customized personal setting. So he's got a bunch of these different types of use cases where he kind of collects this kind of
little Facebook dinosaur, privacy dinosaurs. Was it
yeah, so there's all that choice architecture nudging discussion about whether that's enough to get people to think about privacy.
It's a pretty good metaphor. I think some of the PhD lit theory person who did their thesis on Facebook using the dinosaur to represent privacy.
Yeah, because it's such an old, old and archaic concept.
I'm just conscious
no.
of the time.
It's over.
Did anybody have any concluding questions? Yeah, go ahead, man.
I want to see somebody publish a paper that's titled "If Everyone's Naked, Are You Still Naked?"
Let's get on that. Let's do it.
Yeah, that would be a good one.
All right, so I
don't have. Well, I mean, there's one more from Patrick.
Oh.
Those polls in Facebook check your IQ. How much do you know about the U.S. Constitution? All those things from Facebook that you're required. Oh, I guess he was just giving some
examples of
how they're trying to get your information, trick in an insidious kind of way.
That's right. All right, so I think that's.
Yeah, that's all. I mean, I'm always happy to discuss any ideas anyone might have about this. My dissertation is not actually about it's a concept. Privacy is not a dissertation. So I'm more interested in something
be a private
else.
Dissertation?
Yeah, no one's invited. But obviously it will impact that, hopefully impact that notion. So I'm always open to talking about. I'm also I work with NITI a lot, so we talk about security and encryption quite a bit. So if you guys are interested in that, I'm also open to discussions on that end. So yeah, if that's it, thanks for joining us. Yeah, I'm gonna get into a lot of things. It's hard, like I said, because there's so much literature on quote-unquote privacy. So narrowing it down is really difficult, and trying not to bore you with all of it in 45 minutes is really hard too. So.
Right. So let's thank Kristine.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. And that ends our broadcast.